Welcome, everyone. For those of you who do not know me, my name is Morgan Manley, and I'm the president of the Art Law Society at Fordham Law, a group that is dedicated to bringing different groups from around the country to talk about art issues related to the law, and tonight is amongst those. Tonight I have the pleasure of welcoming the International Foundation of Art Research and its members to Fordham Law. For those of you who are not familiar with IFAR, it is a non-for-profit educational and research organization dedicated to the integrity of the visual arts, which maintains an international art law and cultural property database. In addition, their IFAR journal and IFAR evenings, like this one, are exceptional. I encourage you all to visit the table, which is just outside in Soden Lounge, as well as, of course, view the Fordham Art Law Society's material right next to it. Tonight's program is a part of an ongoing conversation about the actions that the United States can take to protect one of the most beautiful creatures in the world, and the implication that those actions have for the art community. The panel of speakers tonight are amongst the most knowledgeable in the field, and I know we will learn a great deal from them. Now, I would like to introduce to you Dr. Sharon Fletcher, Executive Director of IFAR since 1998. Tonight would not be possible without her, Kathleen Ferguson, and the rest of the IFAR team. Please join me now in welcoming Dr. Fletcher.
Thank you, Morgan. I'm actually used to doing the opening welcome, so I'm not used to being welcomed to the IFAR evenings. But Morgan is one of IFAR's many wonderful former interns. She was our art law intern. I have other interns in this room, former interns in this room too. So we're very proud of the interns who are floating all over. And I want to not only thank Morgan, but thank the Fordham Art Law Society for inviting us to use this very lovely space. There are more people, who will be coming, but we didn't want to delay the start of the program, and they'll be walking in. Also, since this is Thanksgiving week, I wanted to extend a special thank you to all of you for coming in what I know is a very busy holiday period, but I can assure you that you won't be disappointed. As you've just heard, I'm Sharon Fletcher, and I've been Executive Director of the International Foundation for Art Research, better known under the acronym IFAR, for many years. On behalf of everyone at IFAR, particularly our chairman, Tony Williams, who's here this evening, our other board and council members, our very hardworking staff and volunteers, I'd like to welcome you on our behalf to another in our very long-standing and, as you can see, popular series of IFAR evenings. And I will note, Morgan already invited you to look at our material. Please, if you'd like to learn more about us, I hope you do glance through it. And maybe you can learn more about our journal. And this is our current issue of the journal, which features a program that a few of you were at. It's the edited version of the program on the Leonard Lauder Cubist collection. The edited version of the program we more recently did on ISIS and the threat to cultural heritage in Iraq and Syria is being edited for the next IFAR journal. And who knows, maybe after reading this material, you'll even want to subscribe to the journal, or maybe yet even become a supporter. We do an awful lot for the public and the art world and the issues we've been dealing with for 46 years now, from attribution and authenticity to theft, looting, restitution, and other issues, provenance, are now very high on the public agenda, making our work much more important than ever. We'll be publishing an edited version of tonight's program also in a future issue of the journal. And we are videotaping this program, so if all goes well with the videotape, in a few weeks, the videotape version will be posted on our website, where we have the videotapes of several other programs. We can't videotape all of them for various reasons, but we do have several others also posted. And while you're on our website, please check out our online resources, from the Catalog Raisonné database to the Art Law and Cultural Property database that Morgan mentioned. And I'm very pleased to say that Fordham is one of the subscribers to that, Fordham Law School, to that database. And now for tonight's program, which, as Morgan already said, is on an extremely important and topical program, what the art world needs to know about the ivory ban and the proposed new federal rule. We've all seen the horrific pictures of the maimed and slaughtered elephants, killed mainly for the value of their ivory tusks. I needn't repeat all the gruesome statistics. They seem to vary, but it's estimated that approximately an elephant is killed approximately every 15 minutes, about 3,000 a month. These are the African elephants, mainly for the value of the tusks. And it's threatening the very existence of elephants, African elephants as a species. Nothing we say here tonight, nothing is meant to downplay the tragedy that presents. And of course, African elephants are not the only endangered species right now, but we have limited time, and ivory is so important to the history of art that that's going to be our focus this evening. As you will hear tonight, there are several laws and treaties already in place to address the crisis brought on by elephant poaching. Some of these laws directly impact the collecting, the exhibiting, transporting, and selling of art objects, or objects made completely of ivory, and also objects made with only small amounts of ivory. Some of the laws are confusing, some are conflicting. Some affect objects made many years ago, which don't seem to have a direct link to the current poaching crisis. Recently, the Fish and Wildlife Service proposed a change to the Endangered Species Act and solicited public comments about it. Those public comments, which lasted for 2 months, that period ended a couple of months ago on September 28th. And the art community was one of many that weighed in on the issue. We've assembled really a superb team of speakers to educate you on this issue, each from a slightly different perspective. So in other words, carefully chosen. They'll be speaking in the order in which they're seated, starting from my immediate left, Marcus Asner, Ian Wardropper, Craig Hoover, and Michael McCullough. Now you wonder, of course, where is Craig Hoover? Craig wasn't able to come, he's in Virginia. He wasn't able to come up to New York this evening, so we have arranged that he will be participating by remote, and we've tested it. That's why we let you in just a few moments late, because we were double checking. You will be able to see him. He is hearing us. He will hear all the speakers, and he will be participating in the Q&A and discussion period following the official talks. So never fear. Each of the speakers will speak for about 10 to 15 minutes, and then we'll open the program to discussion and Q&A. I really want, and know we will have, some Q&A. So without further delay, I want to introduce the first speaker, and then I will introduce the others as their turn comes. First speaker is Marcus Asner, partner at the law firm of Arnold and Porter in New York. He also serves, and is obviously particularly relevant for this program, on President Obama's Advisory Council on Wildlife Trafficking, where he co-chairs the subcommittee on law reform. Marcus also has other extensive experience with matters relating to wildlife trafficking and supply chain issues, both as a federal prosecutor and in private practice. He was an assistant U.S. attorney in New York from 2000 to 2009, where he was chief of the Major Crimes Unit for 2 years, and I think I'm whistling here, and led a successful prosecution of a case called United States v. Mengus, which is one of the largest poaching cases in history. Mr. Asner will discuss the President's Advisory Council and also present an overview of, if you will, the patchwork quilt of federal laws enacted to save the elephants and other endangered species. So with no further delay, I very, very proudly give you Marcus Asner.
Thank you, Sharon, and thank you, Morgan. I want to also thank Fordham Law School, the Art Law organization, and IFAR for hosting this event tonight. For those of you who don't know this, Morgan actually wrote her student note on this issue. It's terrific. And in fact, I told her, I guess early today or yesterday, that she should really be up here giving the talk and not me. So when Morgan and Sharon asked me to do this talk, I thought this was going to be light lifting. I talk about trafficking issues, going after poachers and bad guys all the time, and this is something that I did both as a federal prosecutor and now that I'm in private practice, and boy was I wrong. This is actually much more difficult than I thought, for really, I think, two reasons. The first reason is that ivory is, and the status of ivory in our society is really different from most any other thing that we deal with. It has a status, and it's had a status in ivory for centuries. So last night I picked this example from the King James Bible, and it was a story of the Queen of Sheba going off to meet Solomon, King Solomon. Here's a picture of it, a painting of it, and she goes there, and the way they describe his magnificence, his wealth, is that he is sitting on a throne that is made out of ivory. And he talks about his ships going out, and what do? They bring back gold and silver and ivory. And you go through art, you go through literature, and ivory plays a role that is really special. And it's something that it cannot be lost as we think through, as a society, how to handle these problems. So what I want to do today is take a quick tour of just setting the stage of really the history of ivory, and I'm going to do the whole history of ivory in about 3 minutes. And then I'm going to walk you through the U.S. federal regulatory landscape. And it's important for me to emphasize U.S. federal regulatory because you're going to be incredibly confused by the federal regulatory landscape. And then keep in mind, we have 50 states as well. So it gets really complicated, and some of the states are really entering into the game, New York State among them, which of course is the center of a lot of the art trade in the United States. So this patchwork is incredibly complicated. So as I mentioned before, ivory plays a role of being historically esteemed. It's something that's precious, it's valuable, it's part of our art, it's part of our culture, it's part of our literature. We say things anywhere from ivory towers to the beauty of a woman by describing her skin as ivory to ivory soap. It's all the way through our culture. It's something that is always something of value. For centuries, even back in the days of Solomon, there was a massive trade in ivory, and it was largely unregulated or illegal. And over time, this led to a decline in the population of elephants. One of the things that we see is that in northern Africa, elephants essentially disappeared. Part of that may be because of climate and other reasons, but over time, the population at least declined in part because of poaching. One of the things, and this is really the main part that is difficult, I think, about this, is that unlike any other area, society's views about ivory have changed dramatically. And so it's really unlike anything else. I mean, the closest I've come up to as an analogy is something like maybe antiquities, how we view antiquities, or how we view slavery 150 years ago, as how society's views change so dramatically within a generation. And this is something that we're trying to deal with. So, the second part of it that's so difficult about this talk is the patchwork. And I'm not going to test you about this at the end, but you're going to get a flavor for how utterly confusing this is. And I was on the phone with Craig Hoover earlier today, who's going to be the guy talking, I guess, third. And I went through it all because I wanted to make sure I got it right. And he said I got it right, and then I asked him how I was doing, and he said, well, you do better than average. And you know, I thought, well, that's kind of like Lake Wobegon, so it's pretty good. But that me, who actually practice in this area, practice criminal law, but also am supposed to know something about this, that will tell you how utterly difficult this is. So we start with CITES. CITES is a convention on international trade in endangered species, and this is in many ways the backdrop on the international trade, but also the federal actions. There are three categories: Appendix A, which deals with species that are endangered. Then there's Appendix 1, Appendix 2, and Appendix 3, and these gradations are how threatened the species is. So Asian elephants, right at the beginning of the enactment of CITES, and became quickly into Appendix 1. It is considered endangered. It's illegal to trade in Asian ivory unless it is an antique. And that's the law since 1975, and it's the law today. So you can't bring in new Asian ivory. You can't bring in Asian ivory that's 20 years old either. It's got to be very old Asian ivory. The situation of African elephants is really where things get really complicated from a legal regulatory point of view. In 1976, Ghana put African elephants into Title III in their country. Then a year later, it went up to Appendix 2, which essentially is threatened but not endangered. And then in 1990, because of a huge decline in the population of African elephants, it went to Appendix 1. CITES put it into Appendix 1. And then people think because of that, the African elephant came back. And it then, at least for some populations, not all of Africa, it went back to Appendix 2, which meant that you could do some trade, at least according to CITES. There were exceptions for pre-convention ivory and hunting trophies. So the idea was that in certain circumstances with healthy populations, hunting actually puts value back in the community. I'm sure we would have 150 different views about that right here, but that at least is the theory here. And in addition, and this becomes important for supply and demand, some of the countries stockpiled ivory before the ban, and they were allowed to sell the ivory in one fell swoops in 1999 and 2008, which put a lot of ivory out into the market. All right, so that's an international convention. The United States has to enact the law, and the thing that enacts the law within the United States is the Endangered Species Act. All right, so it gets a little bit more complicated. You've got CITES, and now you've got the Endangered Species Act. So the United States enacts the Endangered Species Act, and there, rather than having Appendix 1 and Appendix 2, the words are endangered and threatened. So Asian elephants have been endangered since the word go, and as a practical matter, what that means is that you can only bring in Asian elephant ivory if it's an antique, over 100 years old. It also can't be modified at certain times after December 28, 1973. Don't ask me why. And it has to have entered within certain specific ports into the United States. There's also a pre-act exception. So Asian elephant ivory is actually relatively simple. Then what happened keep in mind, Asian elephant ivory is endangered. African elephant ivory under U.S. law is threatened, but the United States decided to pass another law, and that was called the African Elephant Conservation Act. This is in 1989. And under that law, the Secretary of the Interior had to make a decision about whether range countries would have enough controls in place to allow them to export ivory to the United States, and then transit countries also had to be determined by the Secretary of the Interior to allow them to be a transit point for ivory coming to the United States. And the Director of the Interior issued a ruling saying that there is no country in the world that has controls that are up to the United States standards, and so in 1989, the United States issued a moratorium saying no African ivory can come into the United States. Right. In many ways, it's broader, although it's only threatened and not in danger, the ban is broader than that for African ivory. All right, so then what happens is it gets even more complicated. This is the special rule, and this becomes something that is, if your head isn't getting dizzy now, it'll start getting dizzy in a second. Under the Endangered Species Act, the Secretary of the Interior promulgated a rule which is known as 4A. It's also known as 17.40E. And what it said was, despite what we said about the moratorium on the African Elephant Protection Act, we're going to allow African ivory to come into the United States under certain circumstances. So raw and worked African elephant ivory can be imported if it's a bona fide antique and it's greater than 100 years old on the day of import, and that and the other possibility is that it was imported into the United States that it had been exported out of the United States after having previously been registered by Fish and Wildlife. You could you could export worked ivory, so in other words, ivory that's been carved if you have a permit. You cannot export raw ivory from the United States, and you can import sports hunted trophies. All right. So this became the law of the land. This is what everybody operated under for years. Now, this is under the Endangered Species Act. It does nothing, technically, to impact the African Elephant Protection Act moratorium. So Fish and Wildlife, as a matter of discretion, essentially said, well, we're not going to enforce the African Elephant Protection Act different from Rule 4A or this special rule. And that was just a matter of discretion of Fish and Wildlife, and the world operated that way for many years. So, the domestic landscape, pre-February 25th of 2014, sale within a state, this is within the United States itself, sale within a state and across state lines was allowed if the ivory was legal, if it had been imported under CITES, a CITES pre-convention certificate. Also, non-commercial use of ivory was permitted, including movement within the United States. So if you have a piece of ivory, you've got a watch made out of ivory, or a gun with the handle made out of ivory, you could move it across state lines, and personal possession was allowed. So that was the framework. Now, what happens is, come 2014, we go into a new world. And this is where things get especially complicated and why we're all here tonight. What happened? We saw a steep decline in the African elephant population. And I think Craig Hoover is going to talk about that. And this was during the time period when it went from Schedule Appendix 1 to Appendix 2. There was a rise in the economy of Asia. To be blunt, Asia got rich. And because of that, the demand increased for African ivory. We also saw increased poaching, and we see this a lot in the Advisory Council. There are reported ties to terrorist groups within the range countries, which were usually developing countries. There's an undercutting of the law contributing to the local stability. There's a concern about stealing the economic value from the local economy and pulling it out. So when you pay a kid $15 to kill an elephant, that elephant, in fact, for the local community may be worth over $100,000, and that this was contributing large amounts of money to an illegal economy. The concern, and this is why we're here tonight, is that Fish and Wildlife observed that what bad guys were doing to poach the ivory was they were dipping it in coffee to make it look old and doing other things to make it look old to get it into the United States. And so there's some very high-profile cases where Fish and Wildlife busted people for having new ivory that would have been made to look old. So what happens is the Director of Fish and Wildlife issues this rule, 210, and it was modified in May of 14, effectively saying, okay, we're now going to remove the applicability of this special rule from the moratorium, and we're now going to enforce the moratorium. So no commercial imports. Non-commercial imports can be allowed in certain specific instances. Sports trophies, law enforcement can bring in ivory under certain circumstances, scientific specimens, and then worked ivory can be brought in if it was legal and it was part of a household move, it was part of a musical instrument, or it was part of a traveling exhibition. And otherwise, there is no commercial trade, no commercial importation into the United States. It also announced that it would now strictly enforce the antiques exception. So the claimant, the person claiming that they are allowed to bring in African ivory pursuant to the antiques exception had to prove it was over 100 years old, and you had to do things like laboratory testing, which I think Ian's going to talk about the problems with that, using a qualified appraiser, but you can't use an employee of your own company. And think about some of these auction houses trying to bring in stuff, and they're not going to bring in an appraiser from another company. So this is where things stood until, and this is the law of the land as it stands right now. This is the proposed rule. And the proposed rule came in relatively recently. There's a comment period, and Craig, I'm sure, is going to talk about that more. And effectively what it does is it makes trading in African ivory and interstate or foreign commerce prohibited, except if you meet the antique exception. And what it does is it divides trade into one category and import into the other category. So the import, how it deals with importation, is just like the director's order, but how it deals with the trade is very different. So, and I'm sure we'll be talking more about that. Let me talk briefly, because I'm running out of time, about going forward. By the way, I took this picture about 2 months ago with a blackberry in Masai Mara in Kenya, and when I told my 15-year-old son this, rather than saying, wow, he said, Dad, I can't believe you still have a BlackBerry. This is something that is actually, let me just talk briefly and put a point on it. And there's going to be debate about whether this is a good idea or a bad idea. Right now, there's nearly a complete ban on commercial ivory trade in the United States. If you try and fit under the antique exception, it's extremely challenging to establish that something is an antique, and Ian, I think, is going to talk about that some more. The exceptions do not permit people to import many important pieces of ivory made from, or art made from African ivory, such as statues. I myself have an issue dealing with one of those for a client. And many legitimate interests are impacted. And I think Ian's going to talk about museums, but also auction houses, antique dealers, scrimshaw artists. All of these people are impacted. I sit on the advisory council, and we have a lot of hearings. And one of the things that happens is, it's bizarre. It's made strange bedfellows. You'll have gun owners and people from the orchestra groups coming up and talking to us, and they're very opposed to the ivory ban. All of them think that actually we had something to do with the ivory ban, which isn't true, but we listen to them, and they're all incredibly sincere. We see a lot of deeply held views. that some people claim the ban is overbroad, it devalues important art, and I think you're going to hear about that today. Others think it's an important measure to fight what is a serious problem for the whole world, for the United States, recognizing that elephants are important both culturally but as a keystone species in a lot of environments. Others question whether a ban is appropriate here. Is there an appropriate link between poaching and the prior practice? And then we even get people who will talk about the personhood of animals and talk about how animals are, are a higher form of mammals, and that many mammals have emotions, and they talk about things in terms of mother elephant type of discussions. My own personal problem with this, I am torn about the whole thing. I listened to all of it. I think that it is really, as I said, unlike any other issue that we've wrestled with. One of the problems I've had with it is that it has just dominated our meetings. And keep in mind my background was in law enforcement and poaching, and there are some very important fixes that we could have done to the federal statutes and to help fight all sorts of poaching. And unfortunately, the public comment period has always been focused about Ivory. So, thank you. The timing of the director's order, there's some issues, I think, about fairness on that. And why don't we pick some of these things up in the comment period? Thanks.
Our next speaker is Ian Wardropper, who's been director of the Frick Collection, Frick Museum in New York. His distinguished career after finishing his PhD started at the Art Institute of Chicago, where he was curator and later head of the Department of European Decorative Arts and Sculpture, and actually ancient art, since they seem to combine those units at Art Institute. And then he returned to New York in 2001 as the chairman of the Metropolitan Museum's Department of European Sculpture and Decorative Arts. So he went from the Met to the Frick. He's obviously organized many exhibitions, taught art history actually at 6 universities, and published numerous books and articles. But as a specialist in the decorative arts, Dr. Wardropper is really the perfect person to tell us what is special about ivory as an art medium. And frankly, IFAR is an art or a visual arts organization, and I always feel uncomfortable when we do a program. I love the law and want to do the law, but I always feel it's very important to also speak about the art, which is what ultimately brings these two issues together. And so we'll learn a little bit about what's so important about ivory as a medium and why we should care, perhaps, if its ability to be transported and donated is restricted. Ian was also involved with discussions on the Hill on behalf of the museum community in regard to the proposed federal rule changes. So he really is ideal, and I'm very happy to introduce him to you.
I want to thank Sharon and IFAR for organizing this, and I want to thank the Fish and Wildlife Service. While he's doing that, I'm just going to say I also want to thank the Fish and Wildlife Service. I've spoken to Marcus in his capacity as part of the advisory committee at some point, and Craig has been very helpful in addressing the Association of Art Museum Directors on the issues, listening to us and helping to create a dialogue of issues for museums, which is what I want to talk about tonight. I've been asked just to give a few examples of concrete examples of objects that may be affected by the proposed regulations. As Sharon said, all of us support the poaching of elephants for ivory, but museums have long had a role in preserving and collecting ivory among many other media that have been shaped into artistic and historic objects over the millennia. Its white surface was valued for its purity, both symbolically and in reality, and its dense structure has provided a matrix for precise carving which it demands. These features have made it one of the most prized media over the millennia, as Marcus has said, and some of the most significant and religious secular objects have been created in ivory. Tonight I want to just focus on two aspects that affect museums in particular, and they are acquisitions and exhibitions. And I'll start by showing a selection of ivory objects acquired by American museums from abroad over the past 20 years, which without a museum exception to the proposed rules, could no longer be imported. I'll limit myself to European examples. This is both for time and also because it's my field of expertise. But I just want to remind you that I'm just going to be describing a fraction of objects that are affected by this. I won't be talking about ancient Egyptian, Greek, and Roman, or of all periods from the Americas, Asia, India, and many other areas, the Middle East. So I'm just showing a sort of sliver of objects, but objects that I happen to have worked with over the years, and they're all works that are at least 100 years old. When they're acquired by museums, of course, one of the factors is that they're essentially removed from trade and they are conserved and in the public realm. So just quickly, what are a few of these objects that are under effect? This is from the Middle Ages. It's the Fountain of Youth. It was rather charmingly the old man about to dip his foot in, and according couples below, it was probably the cover of a box of wax writing tablets made in Paris between around 1320 and 1400. It's in the cloisters, and it's a tiny object. I should speak a little bit about scale, and I'll try to remember because you can't really tell from the slide. This is about 4 inches high, which is one of the factors when it comes to taking tests to determine if it's ivory, because really the only true test is to do what's called a destructive test. You have to take a fragment of it in order to determine whether it is ivory, and an even more complicated scientific test to determine its age. And many museums simply don't want to do it, especially for an object that's as small as this. This is in the cloisters. Another object in the cloisters, that was secular. This is religious, very small. This is 3 inches high, but very moving, kind of man of sorrows, from South Germany, about 1500, and as you can see, it's been painted and gilded. To move on, to the 17th century, this small ivory statuette, it's about 12 inches high, was done by the Flemish artist François Duquesnoy, who practiced in Rome primarily in the first half of the 17th century. The man, Christ at the Column. I think it's one of the greatest works of any media sculpture that's been acquired by an American museum in recent years. And moving from that, a few years later, from a very smooth and sleek object to a very dense and complicated one. This is a covered goblet that is German, about 1680. It's in the Getty Museum and was acquired around 2006. It represents sort of Minerva versus Bacchus struggling over a youth who's tempted, and I think you can see that from the great leaves that cover the surface, and from his very function as a tankard, Bacchus is winning this battle over the tempted youth. But it's an example of the sheer density of ivory, permitting some of the most complex and intricate carving that can be done in any medium. Ivory was often a secondary material in furniture, as has been mentioned. Just showing you an example that happens to be French, about 1665. It was made by a maker named Pierre Gold, who was probably the most important cabinet maker in Paris at that time, working for Louis XIV, the French king. And in this case, you're seeing a combination of materials, which was highly prized in particularly the Baroque era. So it's a combination of boxwood, ebony, mahogany, tortoiseshell, gilt bronze, and what you see is white are the ivory additions to it, which are inlaid into the as veneers into the carcass of the piece of furniture. And some of the other materials, such as tortoiseshell, are also potentially endangered species, which may come into discussion in the future. Here is a totally different object. I don't think I have to describe the scale to you. It is a Model D pianoforte in stools that was designed by the English artist Sir Lawrence Alma-Tadema, made in London in 1884 to 87 for the Manhattan mansion of the financier Henry Marquand. It's made of ebony, coral, mother of pearl, copper, brass, woods, plus painted scenes by John Pointer. And it was made in London, exported specifically for Mark Wand in Manhattan, found its way back to London where it was purchased at auction, and then returned to this country. It's now in the Clark Museum in Williamstown, Massachusetts. So a great example of a work associated with Gilded Age in New York. And all of these objects were acquired under CITES convention in the period and under the circumstances that Marcus was talking about. As I said, they're all objects acquired during the last 20 years by American museums, and without a museum exception, we wouldn't be able to continue to acquire these things, which I would argue are part of our mission as museums, to be able to show cultures around the world with some of the greatest examples that are possible to display. This is a musical instrument, just as an aside, something which I didn't immediately think about, which has affected another area of the arts, are musical instruments. These happen to be, this is a treble recorder with ivory bands that was made by Johann Heinrich Eichentopf in 1730. It's currently on the market. It's an example of something that couldn't be imported to the United States under current rules, and again, depending on how the ruling finally comes out. Musical instruments are a separate issue. When the ruling came out, there were a number of orchestras, American orchestras, which were in Europe, which were unable to bring their instruments back into the country. The ruling came that suddenly. And so Senator Gillibrand and others were besieged by the orchestras in order to make exceptions so the musicians could bring their orchestras back in. So I'm just citing this as another issue. It actually affected me at the Frick, rather surprisingly. We have a concert program that's 75 years old, and we had a group of musicians from Europe that performed but chose not to bring their personal instruments into the country because they weren't certain if they could get them through customs. So they went to a musical instrument dealer in New York the day before the performance, chose some instruments and played on them. And the review was adulatory, but said one wonders if the fact that they were playing on instruments that were unfamiliar to them affected the performance. So I'm just throwing out another way, perhaps unexpected way, in which the ruling has a wide effect on culture. What has been proposed for musical instruments is a system that could work of essentially acquiring a passport for each musical instrument. So if the musician goes abroad, whenever he comes back, he's got a passport, it's a permanent record, it's permanently attached. This requires a marking system and an ID that has to be approved. However, that's not quite set up yet. And as I said before, we in museums, we prefer not to do destructive tests on objects, and we prefer not to mark them if possible. So it's also, we may get into this more, but it's a very complicated thing to do for American museums in general. And then there are objects classes of objects which may surprise you that ivory is involved at all. Portrait miniatures, for example, were all the rage from the 16th through the 19th centuries. Many of them were done on ivory because it can be smoothed to a very clean, durable surface. So that this particular image, which was made in Paris by Charles-Paul Géron de Préa in 1777 of Benjamin Franklin, was imported to this country some years ago. Most people wouldn't recognize it immediately as a work on ivory, but in fact most portrait miniatures are on ivory, and it raises the question of how much the ivory contributes to the value. Obviously this is a painting, and its value is primarily in the skill of the painter, but physically most of the object is ivory. So it gets into a question which we may talk about a little bit more about de minimis. What's the minimum amount of ivory that might be allowed and be an exception to the rules that are being proposed? I'm now just going to talk briefly about some exhibitions. I'm just going to talk about exhibitions that I've worked on that have been in New York, so you may have known about them. And one of them was called Princely Splendor, the Dresden Court, 1580 to 1620. It was the first exhibition to focus on the period of the Renaissance in Dresden. And it was a traveling show that came to the Metropolitan Museum that I worked on with my colleague Morgan Kuppe. And that went on to Hamburg and Rome. It focused a lot on the Kunstkammer and the Wunderkammer, that is to say, art collections and collections of curiosities from the natural world. This was a moment of great fascination in the natural world, of classifying it, of learning about other cultures, and people would collect anything from narwhal to coral as great wonders of the natural world. And it was also a moment of competition between artist and nature. So turned ivory, as you're seeing an example here, is a perfect kind of cabinet of curiosity object. This one was made by Georg Wecker in Dresden in 1586. You see it's turned and it's actually graduated, so it gets smaller and smaller as it goes to the top. It was an extremely exacting form of art that even the Elector of Saxony, the ruler, practiced learning from Georg Wecker how to do this form. So it's about 20 inches high. And in terms of exhibitions, it has been proposed that traveling exhibition certificates could be applied to exhibitions to help with the regulatory issues. This is something that can be done relatively easily for exhibitions that come from one source. So of the couple of hundred objects in this exhibition, they all came from the Dresden museums. It's easier to sort of, from a regulatory point of view, get all the certificates. They all come from one institution. It indeed can help with the issue of regulating exhibitions. But here's an example from a different kind of exhibition that I worked on. This was called Art of the Royal Court, Treasures in Pietre d'Oro from the Palaces of Europe, which I worked on. It was at the Met, July to September 2008. The other exhibition was in 2004. This was the first exhibition ever in the United States on this topic, that is the topic of heartstones that have been carved and put into furnishings or decorative arts. It was the first ever to explore the international range of this topic beyond Italy to other countries such as Sweden. It won the Apollo Exhibition of the Year, so it was a very important exhibition. Most of it had nothing to do with ivory, but I'm showing you one that is a tabletop with Moorish-style decorations by Bernardino di Leccio, designed by a famous artisan, Giorgio Vasari, and was made before 1557. It was a critical work for the exhibition because in the 1580s, the Opificio della Pietra d'Oro was created. This was an official, sort of state-sponsored workshop for the creation of these objects. This is a very rare example in Florence of the work before the official workshop was created. And as you see, it includes ivory, which is quite rare for these objects. It's the black that you see is ebony, the colored stones are jaspers, and the white is ivory. It raises the question again that we can talk a little bit more about de minimis. This is a proposition that that if an object has less than 1% ivory or less than 200 grams of ivory, that it can be excluded from regulations. At the Association of Art Museum Directors, we've proposed a broader definition that might be 20%. But with an object like this, it's very difficult to determine. I mean, the absolute way would be to take everything apart and weigh it and put it back, which we can't do. And how do you measure something as convoluted? It's by design meant to be a complicated design. So it's also a veneer within a carcass. So it actually might fall beneath 20%, I don't know. But I just raise this as part of the complexity of museums of dealing with these issues. So this is a kind of object that we may exclude in the future from exhibitions in this country. Here's a very different kind of object. It may not appeal to everybody's taste, but we love it at the Frick. It was done by a man named Pierre Goutier, who was the greatest French 18th century bronzier, specialized in gilt bronze and mounting things. So it's primarily gilt bronze, but the lower part is white marble, and the upper part is ivory. It's in a private collection in Paris. We're doing the first ever exhibition on Goutier. It would be the definitive statement on him. There's only a relatively small number of pieces that are certainly by him. This is one. It won't be in our exhibition because the private collector doesn't want to risk sending it to the United States, given the uncertainty of the law. So just again, an example of an exhibition that will be somewhat poorer because we can't show the complete certain works by this one artist. And then just another work which was problematic for us at the Frick. Recently, we sent an exhibition to the Moritz House in The Hague in exchange for an exhibition which was at the Frick, which some of you may have heard of. It was our first exhibition ever that we had sent to Europe. This clock, which was made between 1690 and 1700 in France by André Charles Boulle, one of the great makers of that time period, has no ivory whatsoever on the exterior, so we had put it in the list. But as we were taking it apart for condition check, we found a tiny piece of ivory as part of the inner works. So we removed it from the checklist and had to find a replacement because while we could legally export it to Europe, we were not certain that we could re-import it to the United States under current rules. So our first ever exhibition was somewhat poor because we couldn't send a great example of our clock. So I'm just discussing some of the works. All of them are works at the highest level of quality, all over 100 years. I believe that it's in the public interest to be able to continue to acquire and exhibit these kinds of objects, and I hope that in regulating ivory, that accommodations can be found to continue these kinds of activities. Thank you.
Where our next speaker, Craig Hoover, is awaiting us. So while we're setting it up, let me just introduce him by saying that Craig is the Chief of the Division of Management Authority of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's International Affairs Program. Is quite a mouthful. And he's responsible for developing, the Division of Management Authority is responsible for developing and implementing U.S. policies, regulations, and procedures related to wildlife trafficking. There he is. And also to regulating the CITES Convention, which you've already heard about and we'll hear about again. His office is also responsible for issuing permits under CITES and the U.S. Endangered Species Act and other U.S. wildlife laws. He's actively involved in the Fish and Wildlife Service's efforts to implement the national strategy for combating wildlife trafficking, including strengthening controls on the trade in elephant ivory and other protected species and products. Because it's not really just animals, also it's other things as well. Bottom line, he's the point person at the Fish and Wildlife Service on this issue, and it's he who can tell us, among other things, about not only the general rules and regulations, but more specifically about the comments received during that 2-month comment period, and also some of the next steps after review of those comments. I'm presenting Craig Hoover.
Thank you. I'm glad to be with you virtually this evening. I certainly appreciate IFAR giving me the opportunity to be with you, and thanks also to Fordham University for working through the technological issues. I hope I'm coming through loud and clear on your end. It has been a bit of a challenge on my end with regards to the audio, so hopefully you can hear me clearly. How about someone raise their hand if they can hear me clearly? Okay, wonderful. Thank you. So unfortunately, I couldn't be with you due to other commitments, and I also thought I should be far enough away that so you can't throw things at me. And so I am going to share my desktop now so that I can walk through my presentation. I'm going to mute on your end, both because I have been getting a little bit of feedback and also because I know Michael McCullough likes to heckle me, and so that I won't be able to hear him doing it. Okay, so again, I want to talk a little bit about strengthening U.S. ivory trade controls in the United States, and certainly I will be building on much of what Marcus had to say earlier, and I can confirm, as he noted in his presentation, that he's definitely above average on this subject matter. One of the things I want to underscore is why we're taking these actions. Certainly the United States government is not taking these actions because we want to control the antiques trade or because we're primarily concerned about regulating artwork or musical instruments. We're taking these actions because during 2010 through 2012, the continent of Africa lost more than 100,000 elephants to poaching and rampant illegal trade in elephant ivory. Just some examples, the country Chad now has fewer than 500 animals. They've lost 90% of their elephants in the past decade. More than 60% of forest elephants have been killed illegally in the past 10 years. Tanzania, a country that very recently had the largest elephant population on the continent of Africa, has lost 60% of its elephants in 5 years. That's more than 60,000 elephants killed to supply the illegal trade in ivory. So we're now seeing whole landscapes that are devoid of elephants, with the exception of carcasses. And as I'm sure you're well aware, China is certainly the largest market for the illegal ivory trade, followed by countries like Thailand and Vietnam. But the United States is and remains a large domestic market. We has a large domestic market. We're a significant market for illegal ivory trade, and this has been demonstrated both through our own Fish and Wildlife Service investigations, as well as through investigative market surveys conducted by nonprofit organizations. But the other reason why we need to take action to shore up our ivory trade controls here at home is because it puts us in a better position to push China and Vietnam and Thailand and other major ivory consuming countries to take stronger actions. And just some of the actions we've seen in the last few years include Thailand amending and strengthening its domestic laws and imposing a registration scheme where all ivory in Thailand has to be registered with the government. We've heard China announce that they now have a 1-year ban on the import of ivory. And President Xi, in his recent visit, had a joint announcement with President Obama where he indicated that China would phase out its domestic market over the next year. That's an announcement that we never thought we would hear the Chinese say, and it is, without question, partly a response to U.S. leadership on this issue. And so Marcus talked a bit about the regulatory regime that we have had in place to control elephant ivory trade, and particularly African elephant ivory trade, up until very recently. That includes an import moratorium in place since 1989 under the African Elephant Conservation Act. It includes trade controls through the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, including the uplisting of African elephants to Appendix 1 and essentially a closure of international commercial trade, with some exceptions, since 1990. We also, as Marcus described, have a special rule under the Endangered Species Act that up until now has focused largely on import and export, leaving us a largely unregulated domestic trade in African elephant ivory, with the exception, and with Asian elephants, as Marcus mentioned, Asian elephants have been regulated under the Endangered Species Act since the 1970s, and all import-export and interstate commerce is prohibited, with the exception of bona fide antiques. So in July of 2013, President Obama issued an executive order on combating wildlife trafficking. In February of 2014, the President signed a national strategy for combating wildlife trafficking that included a whole-of-government approach to combating wildlife trafficking. One of the elements of that comprehensive strategy included an announcement that we would impose a near-total ban on elephant ivory trade. And so in order to impose the near-total ban on elephant ivory trade, we had to take a number of actions and are still in the process of taking those actions. The first was to reiterate that 1989 import moratorium and to amend our own enforcement discretion policy so that we are now prohibiting all commercial imports of African elephant ivory, regardless of the age of that item. And that action is largely due to a number of examples of ivory that has been disguised to look old, so that it can be smuggled into the United States market and then sold as antique or older ivory. We also now only allow a very narrow class of non-commercial African elephant ivory imports. These include musical instruments for performances, traveling exhibitions such as museum specimens, and people moving their household or importing inheritances that they've obtained from relatives. And we've also strengthened our domestic controls through our CITES regulations, particularly by prohibiting the sale within the United States of African elephant ivory unless that ivory can be demonstrated to have been imported prior to 1990 or imported with a CITES pre-convention certificate. So those are the actions that we've already taken, which have essentially closed the U.S. market to commercial imports and have limited only certain types of non-commercial imports of African elephant ivory, as well as strengthened our domestic controls through our CITES regulations. But in order to achieve what the President announced, which is a near total ban on elephant ivory trade, we also proposed to amend the Endangered Species Act special rule for the African elephant. We had a 60-day comment period for that proposed rule, and we've received more than 1 million comments during that comment period. And what we proposed in the proposed rule was to limit sport-hunted trophy imports, which are currently only regulated through CITES and not otherwise limited to the Endangered Species Act. And also to prohibit interstate commerce and export of ivory with certain exceptions. And those exceptions include, again, those classes of non-commercial items, musical instruments, traveling exhibitions, inheritances, and household moves. And also, we have proposed exceptions for interstate commerce and export of bona fide antiques and items that contain what we would describe as de minimis amounts of ivory. And the intent here, again, is to create exceptions for those items that we believe are not contributing to elephant poaching and to illegal ivory trade, while providing us with the prohibitions that we need to address those things that are, in fact, contributing to poaching and illegal trade. And just to further look behind those two exceptions, for antiques, the Endangered Species Act, the statute itself defines what is an antique. This is not a definition that we've come up with through the regulatory process. It's actually built into the statute that Congress gave us. And so an antique is an item that's 100 years old or older, and that's a shifting date. Every day, the definition of antique changes with the date. It's an item that's not repaired or modified with an endangered species part after December 27, 1973. And if it's an item that was imported after September 22, 1983, it must have been imported through a customs designated port for endangered species antiques. Now, in addition, the definition of de minimis ivory that we have proposed would include those items that were imported prior to January 18, 1990. Again, that's when the moratorium went into effect. Or they were imported with the CITES pre-convention certificate. The ivory is a fixed component of a larger manufactured item and is not the primary source of value of that item. The ivory is not raw, and the manufactured item is not made wholly or primarily of ivory, and the ivory component itself weighs less than 200 grams. And I know there's been discussion about how we would assess whether an item contains 200 grams of ivory or 210 grams of ivory. The intent of that 200 gram threshold was really to get at a number of objects that we seek to exempt from the prohibition. And again, these include musical instruments. They include older pistols with ivory pistol grips, other items that we have spoken to stakeholder groups about. We don't intend to take items apart in order to measure the amount of ivory on them. We will certainly, if we end up with a final rule, that has this restriction in place, we will provide additional guidance about how we would implement a de minimis exception. And so, as I mentioned, we have received more than 1 million comments. Within those 1 million comments are hundreds of substantive, detailed comments, including, I'm sure, from many of you in the room and at the speakers table. We do intend to have a final rule in place by mid-2016. When we publish that final rule, we will respond to all of the substantive comments we have received. And we believe that both the actions we've taken to date as well as the action we have proposed will ensure that the United States is not contributing to elephant poaching and to illegal trade in ivory, and that we are well positioned to push others to act to address their domestic ivory markets. And so that, in a nutshell, and noting that other speakers have covered some of this material, is the current state of play and where we think we are headed. And I will leave it at that and stop sharing my screen and turn it back over to Sharon.
Michael McCullough, who is a founding partner of the law firm in New York, Prostin and McCullough, which serves the domestic and international art markets. Michael advises clients on purchase and sale and all other matters relating to art objects. And these clients, of course, serve galleries, individuals, museums, and auction houses. He was formerly in-house lawyer for Sotheby's, and he currently is co-chair of the Art and Cultural Heritage Committee of the American Bar Association, and also teaches a course, very interesting title, called Law and Ethics in the Art Market at NYU School of Continuing, I think it's called Continuing and Professional Studies, or just Professional Studies. He was active in some of the discussions with Craig and others regarding the proposed rule, and specifically less so on behalf of museums than on other aspects of the art market. And I'm going to let him speak to that himself, and also bring up the subject of New York State, because I mentioned earlier about a patchwork quilt. Not only do we have federal rules, but there's a New York State rule, which in many respects is actually stricter than the federal government rule. So I'm going to turn the floor over to Michael McCullough.
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to spend a few minutes talking about my experience of working on fish and wildlife issues over the last 20 years, and more specifically about dealing with Fish and Wildlife Service and the New York State DEC on the ivory trade. The other thing is that I expect there will be a lot of questions tonight, so I'm going to leave some of what I wanted to cover to Q&A. I know many of you come to these events as much to speak as to listen, so I'm not going to trespass on your time. So I'm going to try to keep this to about 10 minutes. The slides are available from IFOR, or at least I'm willing to give them out, so if you want to take a look at the slides, IFOR has them. My partner, Bill Perlstein, worked to put together a trade group, which we call the Art and Antiques Trade Group, that was comprised of the two major decorative art dealer organizations, NADA and the League, based in New York. Many of the top dealers in decorative arts in the United States, some of them are here tonight. Also, some of the auction houses participated, Bonham, Skinner, a bunch of others. And some of the Asian art collectors and iGallery participated in this trade group. So the Art and Antiques Trade Group went to Washington, had some meetings with Craig Hoover and other officials at the Fish and Wildlife Service. At the same time, we visited the New York State DEC and met with the DEC, law enforcement people, and policy people. And the point of the trade group and the art market in general was to address important art objects like this one. So this is just one example of one of my favorites. It's something that was actually at the Frick. Was at the Frick, no longer. It is a Baroque ivory carving. It's really beautiful. If you were there at the Frick, I saw it a few times. It's amazing. And it's a piece that left the United States and can no longer come back into the United States for commercial purposes. So this is an example of what the art trade was lobbying on. And why this piece is important as an example is because this is a documented piece. It's known when it was made. The maker is known. It's an important historical object, and it has an art historical significance. So the point the art trade was making to the Fish and Wildlife Service and the New York PEC is that the art trade is interested in documented art historical objects. On the other end of the spectrum is what is the illegal ivory trade, made up of ivory carvings, mostly of an Asian or African motif, some of which are very crude reproductions of Asian and African historical ivory pieces. Anyone with expertise would tell you right away by looking at these are not antique, they have no art historical relevance, and they should not be imported or traded in the United States. And that's the exact point we had made to the government, that these are the types of things we all agree should not be traded. These are the types of objects that should be traded. So what I'd like to do with that introduction is to briefly go through and summarize some of the rules that the other speakers have discussed, and give you a few points on how to comply with these rules if you're actually buying and selling or loaning artwork that contains ivory, and also discuss some of the New York State rules. So let me go through this with relative speed. So the laws we've been talking about tonight are the Endangered Species Act, the Director's Order 210, the appendix and 2 amendments, the proposed rule that Craig discussed, which for this purpose, for the purpose of this presentation, I'm going to assume that what's in the proposed rule will be in the final rule. So the rules I'm giving you will work once the proposed rule is finalized. And CITES. Okay. As Craig pointed out, there's a big difference between commercial and non-commercial trade under these rules. Also, the standard of proof for establishing the species identification of the work that's coming in is best available evidence. So if you're importing an object or trading in an object in interstate commerce, you have to use the best available evidence to determine the species of the material on the object. And that's not true only for ivory. We're focusing on ivory tonight, but that's true for every other endangered species, such as whalebone, tortoiseshell, feathers, bird material, anything else that's on the endangered species list. Also, the Fish and Wildlife Service has the burden of disproving your species identification. So if you're importing and exporting, then the Fish and Wildlife Service can question whether your species identification is correct. I'm not an art expert. I'm also not an expert on material. So if you're trading in these materials, you need the counsel of both A, an art expert, and B, a materials expert. And that might not be the same person. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. Okay, so what I'm going to do first is go through non-commercial trade, which is a little more liberal, and then we'll go through commercial trade. So for non-commercial trade, yes, you can import for non-commercial purposes African elephant ivory, as the other speakers discussed. Under the ESA, it has to be pre-act or antique. And under the Director's Order and Final Rule, it needs to be one of those exempt categories, 2 of which that are important to the art market are either part of a musical instrument or part of a traveling exhibition. For export, same. And yes, for interstate movement in the United States for non-commercial purposes. So movement within the United States for non-commercial is not regulated. Okay. As I said, this is just not to reiterate each one of those categories. ESA pre-act for import, musical instrument, or traveling exhibition. I put loans only because non-commercial could be a loan. It could also be a gift. For purposes of import, it really needs to be a loan only. Export. Again, same rule. Loans work if they're part of musical instruments or traveling exhibitions, and they're ESC antiques or pre-act material. Okay, Asian elephant ivory, as other speakers mentioned, is regulated in a slightly different way. It's protected under the Endangered Species Act. It's not protected under the African Elephant Conservation Act or the proposed rule. Sorry, the Director's Order 210. So, For import, it's pre-act or it's antique. Those are the rules. For non-commercial export, pre-act or antique. For interstate trade, not regulated. Again, imports of non-commercial Asian elephant armor. And by the way, you'll see at the header, because this is under the Endangered Species Act, these rules apply to every other endangered species also. So the rules I'm giving you for Asian elephant ivory apply to all endangered species. So African elephant is slightly different. The rest of the endangered species fall under these rules. So for commercial imports of all endangered species other than African elephant ivory, it's pre-act or it's an antique. And to establish antique status, which Craig mentioned, you have to do several things. First, you need an outside expert to determine that it's an antique. So you need a third party to determine, yes, this object is an antique. Second, you need a determination of species. Usually you have to go to a materials expert. Someone has expertise in the material to determine the species of the material of the object. You have to get a CITES pre-convention certificate from the country of export. And it must be imported, as Craig mentioned, through an antique port. Those are the requirements. Non-commercial export, very similar, pre-act or antique. For antique material that's being exported, there's an additional requirement, as Craig mentioned, that the owner has to establish that the object has been in the possession of somebody in the United States since 9/22/1982, or legally there after imported with the CITES permit. And that's been the continuous possession in the United States. So it's been here since 82 and you can document and it's continued to be here. It wasn't exported and imported again after that. And you need that outside expert's affidavit, just like any other thing you do. And you need a pre-consent certificate from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So when it's outgoing, you need all that documentation and you have to apply for your CITES certificate from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife. Okay, commercial trade is now different. These are the stricter rules that the other speakers have been talking about. There is no import into the United States on the Director's Order 210 for commercial African elephant ivory. That is now banned. You can commercially export antiques. You can trade in interstate commerce in antiques, or as Craig mentioned, de minimis materials, or de minimis amounts of ivory. So let's go through each one of those real quick. There is no import, so we don't have a slide for import for commercial. For commercial exports of African elephant ivory, again, you need an affidavit stating or some documentation stating that the object has been in the United States since 9/22/1982, or legally imported with a CITES certificate after that. You have to document the continuous possession in the United States. You need an outside expert to determine that it is an antique. It is over 100 years old and not restored with any new endangered species material since December 1973, which is the date the Endangered Species Act was passed. And you need that outside expert to determine species of material. Commercial African elephant ivory interstate commerce. This is what Craig and Marcus talked about. This is a little trickier. You need, again, continuous possession since 82 or legal import after. You need documentation supporting that. And the documentation supporting your claim that this object was legally imported has to be something significant, such as a purchase receipt that's dated, a photograph that can be dated, an inventory record that can be dated, an insurance record, an appraisal, something written to prove that the object has been in the United States. You need the outside expert to certify antique status, which we talked about, or the de minimis. So de minimis pops in here for African elephant ivory, which Craig mentioned, and then you need determination of species. With regards to state requirements, which we're going to look at New York in a minute, if you're a state where there are no regulations, you follow the federal rules. So federal rules govern interstate trade in these materials. There are also state rules, so if you're in a state where you're regulated on buyer or seller, or a donor or donee, or in different states, each state's rules have to be followed. Okay, so let's talk about New York then. So the Art and Antiques Trade Group went up to Albany to talk to the DEC and the governor's office about the trade within New York State. The New York rules, as we can see here, are a little more strict. So if you're in New York and you're trading in New York, you need to identify species first. Second, you have to determine that the material is antique. And then a new requirement for New York is that you need an expert to determine that there's a de minimis amount of ivory that is defined as less than 20% of the object's total weight or volume. Now, I say this is for interstate sales only because the Endangered Species Act preempts state legislation in this area. So the Endangered Species Act rules actually trump New York State rules on this point. The Endangered Species Act already requires that the material is 100 years old. So the New York State rule is consistent with the Endangered Species Act, but this 20% is in conflict. So therefore, if you're trading in interstate, between states, New York will allow you to sell material from New York to another state without it being 20%. However, the permit will state that you cannot display the ivory. So if you're selling the ivory to another state, it cannot be displayed in New York State. It can be sold remotely. It could be, an image can be put on the internet. You can put it in a catalog, but you cannot show it, you cannot display it in New York State. You also need a license. So unlike the federal rules, I told you the federal rules have requirements, but there's no permit. There's no federal permit for interstate trade. There are rules you have to follow. It's not a permit. In New York, you must get a permit to sell from New York State. The difficulty with the permit is that New York State DEC has been very tough on determining the age, the 100-year rule. And practically speaking, unless your object is signed, or you have very strong evidence that the object is antique, you will not get the permit. So if you just have an expert say this is a 200-year-old object without any other documentation, without a signature on the object, without something more, that's not enough, generally speaking. So New York State is being tougher. Okay, so to finish up, commercial trade in Asia, elephant ivory follows the Endangered Species Act rules. There are commercial imports in the United States allowed, commercial exports, and commercial trade. For imports of Asian elephant ivory, again, the Endangered Species rules, you need an affidavit saying it's 100 years old, not restored since 1973. You need an outside expert to determine species. And you need a CITES export permit from the country of export. For commercial export from the United States of antiques, again, owner's affidavit of continuous possession since '82, documentation supporting that rule. Third, outside expert's ESA affidavit saying it's 100 years old and not repaired since 1973. Determination of species, which is always required, and CITES pre-convention certificate from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Last but not least, interstate commerce, same thing. Follow the ESA rules, the ones we just talked about. Continuous possession, proof of it, determination of species, and expert's antique affidavit. And for New York State, rules are the same as African elephant ivory. There's no difference between the two species. Have to identify the species, has to be antique. For in-state sales, has to be less than 20%, has to be de minimis. For interstate sale between states, that doesn't apply. And you need a license from the DEC. Now, one thing we haven't heard tonight is mammoth. Mammoth is an extinct species of elephant. It is not regulated under the federal rules because the Endangered Species Act only regulates endangered or threatened species, not extinct species. But New York State does. So you'll notice that to trade mammoth ivory in New York State, you follow the same rules as elephant ivory. So to sell in New York, commercial trade in New York of mammoth requires identification. It is possible to determine, for an expert to determine that something is mammoth as opposed to elephant ivory, because there are differences. The object itself has to be antique. Same definition, over 100 years old, not repairs in 73. You need the de minimis calculation, and you need to apply for a permit. So for mammoth, you need a permit to sell it in New York State. There are still some art dealers in New York State who haven't gotten this message. Not the people in this room. So the people in this room and the people who worked in an art antiques trade group and the responsible dealers follow these rules, and they have been. The people who have not been following the law are a few bad apples in the art community. And the people who sell those tourist-type ivory carvings, the people, you can still today, unfortunately, go to shops in Midtown and buy these little tourist trinkets made of ivory. They're still selling them. Some of them are going to jail for it. And that is the problem. And something that Craig mentioned, I want to reiterate. The reason why the Fish and Wildlife Service and the New York State DEC have been so tough on trading these materials is because two reasons. One, people have recently carved illegal ivory and have tried to trade it as antique. So they've done things like put it in an oven, they've done things like stain it to make it look old. These techniques are common. So the Art and Antiques Trade Group had a solution to that. The one thing that we said to both federal and state governments is, because we believe that there should be a limited trade of bona fide antiques of art historical significance, why not put together an advisory body to the Fish and Wildlife Service, also to the DEC, made up of experts from all over the country in these materials, who can certify that everything imported or exported, because when you import and export you need a permit, that these objects are certified bona fide antiques of art historical significance. That is a solution to the import ban. The import ban in Africa could be taken away if Fish and Wildlife Service could have some degree of comfort that the objects being imported are actually antique. That is not something that has been accepted. I think in the future that is a really good solution to the problem. It would cut down on the number of objects being imported, and only objects that are certified antique by experts in the field that have art historical significance and can be documented should be imported. That's an important thing I think we can work on in the future. Thank you very much for listening.
Craig, are you still there?
I am still here.
Okay, great. Because now you're part of whatever discussion is going to take place. So I know there are going to be a lot of questions here. I have a bunch myself. I don't know if the panelists have any themselves, but I also thought that I might take one moment, just because I'm intrigued by this myself, because I got an email from someone about this program before we did it. Someone who couldn't come, but who's in the music world, and although our focus really is the visual arts, the email said, I'm just going to quote a little bit from it because it's also food for thought and it's very relevant to here, that the violin and bow community has been quite focused on the ivory issue. Newer bows are made of mastodon, which is extinct and thus not endangered, but in customs, agents can't distinguish between elephant and mastodon. And for those using antique ivory, they often don't have adequate documentation, the same as with the artwork, adequate documentation to prove the age and country of origin because no one needed it when it was purchased many years ago. The situation has caused many difficulties and it has damaged the market for bows with ivory tips or frogs, which is the part that one of the violin bow that one holds. Of course, this was the idea behind the laws, but only for new ivory. No one in the violin and bow world wants to see any elephants die for their instruments. Many rare and valuable bows are being, quote, re-tipped to remove the ivory and mastodon to avoid problems at the borders. But this can't be accomplished without removing a little bit of what's called the prenambuco, the bow wood upon which the ivory tip is glued and the bow is primarily made. It's definitely a sensitive and difficult topic. So I just mention this because while we're focused on the visual arts, the musical instrument community, and particularly the violin community and the bows, are really just as interested in what's going to happen with the proposed rule.
I'm wondering why a violin or a bow is more sacred than, for example, a piece of Ruhlman furniture, where I have been in a cabinet shop where the ivory in a piece of Ruhlman furniture and a piece of absolutely ultimate quality and importance, the ivory was being removed and being replaced with white plastic. Why are the violins and bows in a separate category?
Well, they're not. I mean, that with the email was someone saying the same thing as you are. I was just mentioning this as part of the larger issue, that they're concerned the same way the visual arts community is. I was just pointing out. I wasn't making it more important than this.
We are in an era where there is vandalization going on almost as we speak.
I think Stuart should just clarify for the audience who may not know that Ruhlman, having practiced in the 1920s, is not antique, and so there are great masterpieces which are not subject to these rules.
It will be in 5 years.
Okay, if you can wait long enough.
The other question, while I have this, is we've been talking about imports and exports, but what about an American miniature made in 1770 by Charles Wilson Peale, where there would, of course, be absolutely no record of a port of entry or anything like that?
Maybe someone on the panel or Craig can address that.
I can speak to that. So if an item's 100 years old or older and it was produced in the United States and can demonstrably be documented to have been produced in the United States, then it can qualify as antique. The Director's Order 210 language, with regard to the definition of antique under the Endangered Species Act, makes clear that we will only enforce the port requirement for an item that was imported and for an item that was imported after those ports were established in 1983. And so certainly an item that was crafted in the United States can qualify as antique, and that therefore can be the antique exception under the Endangered Species Act.
Hi. In the insurance company, we're struggling with the idea of how would you insure objects that are being put out to loan that contain ivory in the works. Can you address that, and how would you appraise them if you can? What value would they have? How would you answer that question?
Does anyone want to tackle that? Michael?
It's a complicated issue because appraisers normally look to the market for comparables to compare them to. And there is a certain portion of the market now that's perhaps undocumented. So, as we mentioned, objects that were made in another country and imported that are antique can be traded, but only if they're documented. So you have to show legal importation, as my slide showed. You have to show that it's in continuous possession in the United States. If you can't document those objects can no longer be sold in interstate commerce. So the problem is that many of the objects that were sold before 2014 might not be able to be sold on today's market. So the appraiser has the problem of determining whether the object that they're comparing to is legitimate. Now, the person I speak to is Linda Selvin from the Appraisers Association of America. Raise your hand. Talk to Linda about that, because the Appraisers Association was actually, I should have mentioned earlier, they were part of the Art and Antiques Trade Group that lobbied the Fish and Wildlife Service and DEC, and they played a huge role in helping clarify some of these issues. So I would talk to Linda, and she can give you some more information about that.
Yeah, I mean, it just, basic economics tells you that it is going to impact the value of things, and working through this puzzle that we tried to lay out for you is going to be hard. I'll give you an example that I tried to deal with as in my private practice, where I had somebody who purchased at auction in Europe a figurine made out of ivory from the 15th century. And so it is a commercial purchase. He purchased it in December of when was the special order came out? It was 13 or 14? It was, I think it was December of 13. And the item was still overseas, wanted to bring it back to the United States, and the special order comes down in February. And try as I might, I cannot get that thing into the United States. Does that impact the value? Of course it does. Now, how you appraise that, good luck with that. It's tough.
It's not unlike, say, an object that's in Italy and cannot leave Italy. It has its value is quite limited. It's only people that in Italy would buy it. Whereas if it can go anywhere, obviously its value may be much higher. The same is true for Ivory now.
One of the things that I've been pressing for a little bit on the advisory council, we have sort of soapbox about power. We have no real power. We have soapbox power. Is that they enact some sort of equitable way of dealing with some of these things. The Department of Interior has something called a remission process, where essentially they can give you mercy if you show that you acted in good faith, et cetera. And I would like that to be more systematized, and I think it would do Fish and Wildlife a lot of good to do that. Craig, when I raised this point at the last advisory council meeting, was very, very skilled at avoiding that, because it really isn't his authority to make that decision. But it is something that I think would be useful to have a little bit of a way around it, something like a court of equity would handle something versus a court of law.
Apropos of that, if I could just ask a follow-up, because I'm unclear on this. Since museums are, as non-commercial entities, have certain prerogatives under the new rule, maybe not as many as they'd like. I've read the AAMD comment, but they are able to get donations to the museums. They're asking for a broader...
That's been clarified just recently.
Yes, but I'm curious, the person who makes the donation, since that work is technically not marketable, so can they no longer take that tax write-off? I'm kind of curious how that works and will work.
Well, that's a complicated question, but it depends on the object. Its value may be less because of its rules now. If it was a completely open market, then presumably the highest bidder would get it, but it has a lower value. There hasn't been enough time really to determine if this is going to have an impact. But in the museum community, we're glad that at least this is now apparently will be the law, that people can make donations so that these objects can continue to come into a public forum. And for the most part, will be out of trade for the future. That's part of the intent of this law.
Okay, there's a question there, Mona. Hold on for the mic.
I'm an art historian, and I'm new to this debate, but it does seem to me that the tail is wagging the dog here. I don't really understand why illegal activity is defining or is controlling what would otherwise be illegal activity. In other words, we should have painting because there's forgery. We shouldn't have sex because it's illegal sex. I mean, one should find a way, as one gentleman on the panel said, to regulate rather than to say all antiquities cannot be, shown or traded or whatever, all legal all the rigmarole that I've been listening to. So I don't know if someone wants to address that, or if they just want to...
Does anyone want to tackle that question? I mean, it is a legitimate question. Why should it be the lower denominator that determines what everyone else does just because a few people are cheating? Why is no one able to?
I think Craig should chime in on that if he wants to, but I do think something I said earlier is important. The art market has been used to sell illegal ivory. Art dealers have sold illegal ivory. It's not just, Now, the problem is, as I mentioned, for the government, is that the government doesn't know the difference between antique ivory and non-antique ivory. I mean, they're not experts in this. Our solution was to create an advisory body, but that's a complicated thing to do. And there is actually a very big trade in elephant ivory. I mean, it is a huge trade. So it is a complicated problem. And the fact is that the art market has played a role in this. Now, have the legitimate dealers played a role in this? No. The legitimate dealers have always followed the rules. But at the same time, you have to recognize this is a huge problem. And the difference between the other examples he gave is there are elephants dying and becoming extinct. That is the big difference. So,
Let me add into that. I mean, I think, and I agree with everything Michael said there. Look, in law, there's always a conflict between bright line rules and particular instances where the bright line rules as applied lead to perverse results. And I can go through and come up with 500 examples of that, and all I can say is I feel your pain. I get it, and I think that this is something that everybody's struggling with. It is plainly in the interest of the world for Ian to get donations of important pieces of art. Nobody is claiming anything different. On the other hand, it's also in the interest of the world for Craig to prevent bad guys from bringing in new ivory by passing it off as antique. Where you draw that line, government, because of administrative reasons, because of just the reality of trying to employ laws and enforce laws, draws bright line rules. And it's just, unfortunately, there's always going to be people who suffer by these. That's why, my hope is that we can have some sort of equitable way of dealing with things on an ad hoc basis and trying to resolve them.
Hi, I'm in the auction world, so I do want to make sure that we follow the regulations and follow the law as closely as we possibly can. I think there's a way of trying to ensure that we follow the law, but making sure that the determinations that we aren't so difficult that it makes it impossible to follow the law. One of the things that I find the most difficult, I don't think it was addressed here, is about species determination. And so if an auction house has the expertise to determine the age of something, the origin of something, whether it's been modified or not, and whether or not it's come in legally, what about species? If we can't be the ones to determine what that species is, with all of the expertise that we have and we've had over the years, who do we turn to do that? And does that, and this is directed to Craig, I'm sure, does that still need to be a scientific analysis, or are there other methods now that are acceptable to the government to determine species that aren't intrusive, aren't invasive, won't destroy the work, and aren't costly?
I think the question related to complexity and the difficulty figuring out what the rules are and the challenge, particularly with regard to identification of species, is that?
And more specifically, I think that the person asking the question is from an auction house and said that they have their own expertise to do this and want to know why they can't be the people able to do this and who would need to do that for them in order to identify the species.
Right, which I'm guessing refers to the Director's Order 210 language about third-party appraisal. I see Michael nodding, so I think that I'm on the right track. So,
is that correct? Is that what you're referring to?
Yeah, and so in terms of the issue of complexity, I think we all agree this is about as complex as you can get in terms of, at least in terms of wildlife law, navigating the different rules for the different species and the different statutes. Part of that challenge is because Congress has given us the Endangered Species Act, they've given us the African Elephant Conservation Act, we have signed an international treaty called CITES, and so we have a number of different rules in play. One of our goals with regard to revising the special rule for the African elephant is to try to harmonize a bit more and to make the rules more consistent across the board. Of course, if we want to be really black and white and really consistent, then we would have a blanket prohibition as we do with regard to the Asian elephant, with the exception of antiques. With regard to the issue of third-party appraisals, much of this Director's Order 210 criteria for identifying antique was drawn from IRS rules. The objective with regard to third-party appraisal was obviously to get away from their having a financial interest in a particular house. But as Director's Order 210 is a policy document, it's a document that is subject to revision. And as has been mentioned several times tonight, Director's Order 210 has been revised now twice, specifically to accommodate the concerns that we've heard from stakeholder groups. And so there's certainly that possibility in the future. And in addition, we will be revisiting the conditions in the Director's Order once we finalize the special rule for the African elephant, because we're proposing regulatory changes that would differ from the Director's Order. And so this is a discussion that we're happy to continue to have with those who are challenged by the conditions that we've laid out.
Can I just add to that, getting back to the point of using expertise, I showed some medieval ivories, for example, in the cloisters, and in New York, some of the greatest medievalists in the world are at the Metropolitan Museum in the cloisters. It's their job to determine authenticity, to determine age, place of the place where it was made, and also the material that it's from. And some of the best experts are in museums. They're also in auction houses, certainly Sotheby's, Christie's, Arnold, all the auctions in New York. Some of the greatest dealers in the world. Some are in this room. There's an enormous expertise and knowledge that can be brought to bear that answers the basic questions if that can be accepted, or a means can be found to accept expertise. Because museum, we have to know these things. The IRS supervises this. We have to be able to determine exactly what something is before we accept it into the museum, and that same expertise can answer, I believe, many of the questions that that Fish and Wildlife Service legitimately has about these objects.
Next question, Tony.
I'd like to ask Dr. Wardropper that in the history of art, have tusks from other animals, walruses and rhinoceroses, been used the same way? And if so, are those animals going to come under this sort of ivories or whatever they are going to be under this restriction too?
Yeah, there's a huge number of other bone and tusk material that's been used. The objects that I've been showing you, as far as we know, are African ivory, but mammoths have been raised today, and I think increasingly we're recognizing how many works of art were made from mammoth tusks. And it's one of the basic questions we have to answer. In fact, quite often an object is kind of assumed to be ivory until one looks more closely, and it often then turns out to be walrus or bone or some other kind of material. So indeed, that's part of the question, part of the problem. The expertise has to be able to ascertain what the object is, and those are difficult either from a point of knowledge. For example, experts, conservators at the American Museum of Natural History specialize in that kind of identification. There are some scientific tests, but by and large, people in the field who are art historians in that field can also recognize the different types.
To throw a support to Craig here for a moment, the intent here is very sincere. I don't think that anybody is trying to pick on you. I think what's going on is that they were losing about 100,000 elephants a year, I think was the number I heard, or over a relatively short time period, African elephants. And we're not seeing that with other species to the same degree. I don't know whether there are particular species of walrus or other things that are similarly in trouble, or whether Fish and Wildlife has problems distinguishing, as a practical matter, between the different types of ivory, which would drive a bright line rule or something like that. But I think what really is the impetus behind this was a crisis. And the crisis was that there was a genuine fear that the African elephant wouldn't be around for much longer.
I saw in the press that they are actually removing the tusks from rhinoceroses in order to preserve the animal so that they won't be poached. They don't have a horn.
And I'll give you a very perverted follow-up on that. Is what the hunters are doing, the poachers are doing, is they spend some time trying to stalk the rhinos, And if they see a rhino where the tusk has been cut off, they kill it anyway. So they don't have to waste time stalking them again. So it's a horrible world over there.
Our topic tonight is about ivory, and this question of rhinoceros horn and other material is very important because New York State regulates the trade in rhinoceros horn the same way it regulates ivory and mammoth. So if you're trading in a rhinoceros horn, you're subject to the same rules I mentioned, which is you can't outsell objects within the state that have over 20% of the materials. And the purpose of the 20% is to knock out all of the carved material from the market. So freestanding carved objects can no longer be traded in New York State. They can be traded in interstate commerce, not within New York. And then on the point of identification, Anibal Rodriguez from the Natural History Museum is an expert in these materials, and he consults with most of the dealers and auction houses. So he's a resource that people in the art market go to determine the species of material. There's lots of studies being done right now on determining the difference between African and Asian elephant ivory. They're the same animal, but there are people working on this issue. And the last thing I want to mention is the expertise point, because there are people in this room, such as Ian Scott Deffrin, the intelligent-looking guy, third row back on the center aisle, who dedicate their lives to studying ivory and determining age of objects and determining materials. So there's a lot of knowledge out there, but in fairness to the government doesn't have this knowledge. It really is in the private sector. So the goal really should be, how do we get this expertise from the private sector into the government?
That's been my comment. How do you tell the difference between the different species? It is an almost impossibility without genetic testing, without any basic testing that would ruin an art object. In other conversations with Mr. Hoover, at least as far as enforcement in the antique rules, it doesn't really matter if it's Loxodon to African or if it's Africanus, if it's Asian or whatever. As long as it's antique and it can be proven, you really don't have to distinguish the species. If you actually go to the rules, when they actually ask about species, we're only identifying genus as a general rule. In the New York rule, when they ask for a mammoth species, Mammuthus is just a genus. There's 13 different species, and I assure you, no one's ever written a rule, never bothered trying to identify a species on a carved art object. It's an impossibility. The sample size required to do that type of testing is often larger than the pieces. So, at least for enforcement, even though the letter of the law, I guess, states that you're supposed to find the species, it is impossible. It's absolutely impossible without ruining an object in most cases. The handbooks that Fish and Wildlife have, it's pretty easy if you have an entire tusk. And you can look at Schrager angles and measure them, from a cross section. And even there's with African and Asian, there's a crossover in the outside Schrager angles.
Well, look, we all know, we've said it's a complicated issue, but for commercial purposes, it does make a difference which one it is. So, if you talk to Andrew Pearlstein or John O'Halloran from Masterpiece, those guys are experts in importing and exporting. They'll tell you how that difference works out. And practically speaking, I mentioned earlier, best available evidence is the standard that you have to apply for determining species. What that means for any particular object might be different from one object to the other. So this is, talk to those guys and they can tell you exactly how, practically speaking, when you're importing or exporting at the border and dealing with a law enforcement person from Fish and Wildlife, how this plays out.
In a worked piece, that's what I don't understand, other than historical record.
Well, again, best available evidence is going to be based on both historical record and scientific testing. And what that means for one object compared to the other might be something different. But again, talk to those guys and they can tell you exactly how this plays out.
Okay, I would love to know if there's scientific testing available commercially for people in this industry.
There is DNA testing available. There are people working on this issue right now as we speak. Practically speaking, I think scientific testing alone doesn't get you all the way there.
My question is about these third-party experts and how the increased stringency of the regulations may or may not affect their willingness to sign an affidavit, and if there's any kind of indemnity for their opinion.
Look, I'm going to guess, but why not? I think indemnity would really be according to the contract between the expert and the principal, and so you could try and arrange for that. I actually don't think that it's going to lead to a whole lot more liability because you have experts all the time dealing with things like provenance, and you always have a certain amount of pressure on the expert. I imagine that same sort of model would apply. If anything, if this really is going to continue to be a robust market, you'll create this little subcategory of people who are experts in this particular field, and maybe that's good for them. I don't know, but certainly I think you would look as a model to the folks who advise on provenance.
I'm going to end with this sort of host prerogative with a quick question of my own to Craig. Craig, why is there such an exemption for sport hunting trophies?
Under the African Elephant Conservation Act, that in fact is the only exception to the moratorium. So it explicitly prohibits us from prohibiting the import of sport hunting trophies through the African Elephant Conservation Act. Through the Endangered Species Act and through CITES, sport hunted trophies are regulated, and the intent there is to ensure that sport hunting is actually contributing to conservation. All of the other activities that we're talking about with regard to antiques and musical instruments and other pre-existing ivory items are at best conservation neutral. They're not contributing to conservation. They're not necessarily undermining conservation. With regard to sport hunting trophies, it's our position that a well-regulated, a well-managed hunting program actually contributes substantial resources back to conservation by paying for protected areas, by paying for rangers to protect populations, by supporting anti-poaching controls. And if you look at the countries that have actually done a good job of managing their elephants, Namibia, South Africa, Botswana, those are countries that have robust elephant populations, and they also have, with the exception of Botswana, which closed its sport hunting very recently, they actually have active sport hunting programs where primarily U.S. and European hunters pay tens of thousands of dollars to go hunting, and that money goes back into conservation and wildlife protection.
Yeah, let me put a point on some of the things we hear during the advisory council. Some of the poachers will pay kids an incredibly small amount of money to go shoot an elephant. I've heard things like $15, $20 to shoot an elephant. And if you have a robust game warden regulatory scheme, like we do in the United States, say we're deer hunting or whatever, what you do is you end up putting the value back into the local community, and by increasing the value in the local community, the elephant becomes valued and the community helps police it. That at least is the theory. I think obviously people will debate about it. The biggest debate with respect in the advisory council in this area is with respect to these countries where you really don't have a rule of law. Corruption is pervasive, and can you really have the sort of regulatory scheme that we have in the state of New York for deer hunting when you can bribe the game warden or something like that? And so that's part of the debate. You need a rule of law in order to have a robust hunting conservation effort.
I had a chance to look through the comments in the proposed rule on the website, and they all seem to be, let's save the elephants, and I just wanted to see if anyone in the panel could comment on maybe the anxiety that the art world is feeling with transporting and exhibiting things that are technically not illegal, but perhaps widely seen as immoral outside of this room of art network.
I'll just comment briefly from the advisory council. We have our portion where we're speaking, and then there's a public comment period. And during that public comment period, there are people who are along the lines of what you talk. But the art world, the musician world is robustly represented and speak at every meeting.
So the last question, and the microphone over there, and don't feel any pressure on you.
American Institute for Conservation of Historic and Artistic Works. We are the national organization that's concerned about the preserving of objects made of ivory and other endangered species, as well as paint, linen, and so forth. And we have just now come out with a position paper on that subject. The title of it is The Preservation of Cultural Property with Respect to U.S. Government Regulation of African Elephant Ivory. It is available on our website. The page of our website looks like this, and you don't need to know. American Institute for Conservation of Historic and Artistic Works, or just www.conservation-us.org.
Thank you. And actually, on that positive note of another statement about the issue of ivory, but from the point of view of those people who protect art objects, let's end this program and join with us both in thanking our really fabulous speakers and our